Take your Bibles and go to 2 Samuel chapter 13. 2 Samuel chapter 13 is where we're going to be today. And we're going to kind of go through a survey of a few chapters. We're continuing. We're in week 4 now of our series, Weapons of Self-Destruction. What you're holding on to is probably sabotaging you. And so today we're going to talk about the battle of bitterness. The battle of bitterness. I found a story this week that I thought was pretty funny. It was reported by the Associated Press several years ago. So I'm just going to read it straight from their original report. It said, for 43 years, Zenaida Braganstova had been telling people that there was a World War II bomb buried under her bed. The story began in 1941 when the Nazis were advancing towards her town in the Ukraine that she lived in. So one night, at the very start of the war, she was sitting by the window and sewing on her sewing machine. Suddenly, she heard a loud noise followed by a whistling sound. She got up to see what it was, and just a split second later, she was struck by a blast of wind. When she came to, the sewing machine was gone, and there was a hole in the ceiling and in the floor. Zenaida couldn't get any officials to check out her story, so she just moved her bed over the hole and lived with it for the next 40 years. Finally, the woman's problem was uncovered. As a phone cable was being laid in the area, demolition experts were called in to probe for buried explosives. One lieutenant asked her, "Where's your bomb, Grandma?" "No doubt, it's under your bed." Miss Braganstova looked at him dryly and said, "Yes, I've been trying to tell you, it's under my bed." Sure enough, there they found under her bed a 500-pound bomb. After evacuating 2,000 people from the surrounding buildings, the bomb squad detonated the bomb. According to the report, the grandmother, freed of her bomb, will soon receive a new apartment. The moral of that story, and where we're going today, is the fact that many people in your life and in this room, some of you, live like that grandmother. You have a proverbial bomb under your bed. It's a terrible secret. It's a hurt. It's a seething anger that has been there for years while everybody else goes about their business. You've done a good job of concealing it, hiding it, but nobody, just like in this village, no one is safe until that bomb is removed. This morning, again, we're going to talk about the battle of bitterness. We're in the next to last week of our series, Weapons of Self-Destruction. And this morning, I want to start just with one verse in the letter to the Hebrews, written by Paul, I think. This is what Paul says. "Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many." And it's interesting that he calls it a poisonous root of bitterness, because as you go through the Bible, anytime, most of the time, when you see a reference to something being bitter, it's not just a taste that's in your mouth, it's poisonous. It's deadly. Whatever it is that's being called bitter is actually posing a threat to the safety and well-being of whoever's involved. So bitterness is not just a taste, it's poison. It's poison. And so the ESV study Bible, the ESV is the translation of the Bible that I normally teach out of, but this morning I'm going to be in the New Living Translation. But the ESV study Bible says this: a bitter and resentful person is like a contagious poison spreading resentment to others. So this morning in 2 Samuel chapter 13, we're going to talk about, 13 through 18 really. We're going to talk about somebody that you, I'm sure, have heard of. Most of you, if you've grown up in church or really you spend any time in church, we talk about him a lot. This guy's name's King David. I'm sure you've heard of him. And King David is let me just take you back to last week when we talked about the fact that the people in the Bible aren't to be looked at as models. In other words, we shouldn't say, well, I need to be more like David. I need to be more like Abraham. No, they serve us as mirrors, not models, mirrors in which we can look at their life and go, man, they were really messed up and God still used them. I can see myself in that person. And King David, like everybody else, had a lot of problems. In fact, he probably resembles your modern day Christian, most of the people sitting in this room right now, better than anybody else. Because David had this great public life, But behind closed doors, his family life was a wreck. Publicly, he was God's chosen man. He was the king of Israel. He had won every battle he'd ever gotten into. The people loved him. He had brought prosperity to Israel and peace to Israel. I mean, he was God's chosen man. Out here on the outside, everything was great. But if you dug into his family life, it was a wreck. And that is the place where many Christians in this church and in this town, and many people that you know, that's where they are. Everything's great on the outside. Everything's hunky-dory on the outside. And you're like, the great family, man. They got a wife and kids and a dog, and they come to church every week, and they give money and all that stuff, but behind closed doors, it's a mess. It's a mess. I think many of us can identify with that. And the reason David's life was a mess in large part was because of a cycle of sin that he had created in his life that was spilling over and affecting the rest of his family and his children. This morning we're going to look at one of his children in particular, a guy named Absalom. Absalom let bitterness control and ruin and make a wreck of his life. And the first thing that I want you to understand this morning, well, let me back up. Just kind of give you a little bit of background here. The Bible says that David had many concubines. Now, kids, if you want to know what a concubine is, ask your parents. Adults, if you don't know what a concubine is, don't ask me, okay? Because I'll tell you. But he had a lot of concubines, which means that he had a lot of children with a lot of different women. And in 2 Samuel chapter 13, one of those children, the Bible says, was a very beautiful young woman named Tamar. Now, I can almost guarantee you that your kids, if they're in kids worship, are probably not going to be learning about Tamar this morning. At least you got a lot of explaining to do to them when they get home. But in chapter 13 of 2 Samuel, Tamar is raped by one of her half-brothers, a guy named Amnon, one of David's sons with one of his many concubines. Very wicked, very evil person. Rapes his half-sister, Tamar. Well, her full brother, Absalom, one of David's other sons, finds out about this. And needless to say, he is crushed. He is absolutely devastated. He is angry. She tells him about it, and he says, don't say a word. I'll take care of this. I'll take care of this. Now, I want you to understand this verse this morning. That the root of bitterness grows out of the deep soil of pain. Bitterness begins, when we talk about the poisonous root of bitterness in your life, we're talking about a root that begins its growth in the deep soil of pain. I want you to see what happens. Amnon rapes Tamar. Absalom's furious, and look at verse 21 of chapter 13. When King David heard what had happened, he was very angry. Period. Does anybody see something wrong with that? His daughter has just been raped, and he just gets angry. He just gets angry. And though Absalom never spoke to Amnon about this, he hated Amnon deeply. He didn't just hate him, he hated him deeply because of what he had done to his sister. The root of bitterness grows out of the deep soil of pain. I think it goes without saying that Absalom here is absolutely crushed. He is hurt for his sister and what's happened to her. He is hurt by the sin and the wickedness of his brother who raped her. But I want you to pay attention. I think this goes even deeper. Look at verse 21. He's hurt by the failure of his father. The one man that could have made things right. The one man whose daughter was just molested and abused, who could have ended it like this and said, done with Amnon, put him to death, put him in jail, whatever, I don't want anything to do with him. This is David's moment that he could have vindicated and made everything right, so to speak. He couldn't undo what was done, but he was the king, he was the father, he was the head of the home. But what does David do? He just gets angry. He just gets angry. Before the time of Jesus, the world began to speak the Greek language. And these scholars translated the Hebrew Old Testament into the Greek language so that everybody could have access to it and read it. It's called the Septuagint. And those Greek scholars translated this verse saying this, "But David did not punish his son Amnon because he loved him and he was his firstborn son." Does anybody else, does that just feel bad? I mean, that just feels heavy. Why didn't David do anything? Maybe it was because he was under this cloud of guilt because of his sin with Bathsheba, and he felt like a hypocrite for doing something. Or maybe it was because Amnon was his firstborn son, and he just showed favoritism to him. But can you imagine Absalom, the deep hurt that he had to have experienced here? Not only has his brother raped his sister, but now his dad won't do anything about it. His dad is just sitting back and letting it happen, sweeping it under the rug. Some of you have been in there in your life before. Something has happened to you, and it's just, what happens? We're just going to sweep it under the rug. We're going to act like nothing happened because we can't bring shame and embarrassment on the family. And so we're just going to slap them on the wrist and act like it never happened because nobody needs to find out. This is exactly where David is. This is exactly what Absalom's going through. Bitterness begins in the deep pain of life. Some of you are going through this in your life. Someone somewhere hurt you deeply. In 2 weeks, we'll mark the third anniversary of you voting me as your pastor, and something I'm grateful for. But over the last 3 years, I have just been shocked at how common sexual abuse is. Some of you women, and it's more rampant than I could even have imagined. Some of you, men and women, were sexually molested as children. Hey, it hits close to home. She shared it publicly, so I'll share it here. My mother at the marriage conference shared about her sexual molestation as a child. Never knew that about her. And I heard. It was a family member. Some of you are coming out of a bad relationship. Some of you are in a second marriage, and that first marriage was horrendous. Physical abuse. Talked with one of our members last night. We meet up here and pray on Saturday nights. His wife's a dispatcher for the Anderson County Sheriff's Department, and he said it just blows my mind how many domestic violence cases there is in this town. You've been cheated on, you've been hurt. Somewhere, someone along the way has hurt you. Verbal abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. Someone has hurt you deeply. And look what it says in verse 22. He hated Amnon deeply. He didn't just hate him, he hated him deeply. Those are strong words. See, the Bible has what I like to call hangnails. You know, like hangnails, they get on your nerves. And they're irritating, and you don't like them, so you just file them down or you cut them. Well, the Bible is real life stuff. And sometimes we like to just kind of file over that and gloss it up, but hey, sometimes we just need to let the hangnail hang there and let it rub us wrong because it's meeting us where we are in our life. Some of you have been hurt deeply. And that's where bitterness begins. The root of bitterness begins in the deep soil of pain. Someone, somewhere, said something, did something to you, and it hurt. It hurt deeply. Bitterness is a root, and it needs things to grow, just like any plant. And all bitterness needs to grow is just a few things. Just like any plant, it needs food. The miracle grow of bitterness is unforgiveness. You want to grow that root of bitterness? You throw in a little unforgiveness in there, and it'll grow. And listen, some of you who have been hurt deeply, that's easier said than done. Forgive. Hey, it's much easier said than done. But I'm going to tell you, and we're going to see at the very end of this message, that unforgiveness is the food that grows the root of bitterness. The poisonous root of bitterness needs food to grow. It needs an environment. It needs a good environment. Look at verse 22. It says that Absalom never spoke to Amnon about this. He didn't talk to him about it. He didn't confront him. He said, I'm just going to hold off. He covered it up. This man had never talked to David about it. He never talked to his brother about it. He covered it up. He let it fester. He bottled it up. He let it grow. He held it in. He never let go of it. Hey, let's just be real for a second. This guy's sister was just raped by his brother, and his dad was a wuss and didn't do anything about it. That's kind of hard to let go of. But he held it in. And he fed it that food of unforgiveness, and he just gave it that nice environment. He harbored it. He let it fester. He let it grow. And he gave it time. He gave it time. Look at verse 23. 2 years later. 2 years have passed. Absalom's sheep were being sheared at Baal-hazar near Ephraim. And Absalom invited all the king's sons to come to a feast. He went to the king and said, my sheep shearers are now at work. Would the king and his servants please come to celebrate this occasion with me? This is not just let's have a party. After 2 years of feeding that bitterness, feeding that hatred, Absalom has finally come to the place where he's ready to take out his anger and let bitterness grow over. He is asking for Amnon to come to his place where he's shearing his sheep. Why? Because as we're going to see in just a second, he eventually kills Amnon. He kills him. He didn't want David there. He didn't want to have a party. He wanted to get his brother there alone where he could take out 2 years of hatred and bitterness on him and make him pay for what he did to his sister. And he was going to, when he got done with him, Amnon, he was going for his daddy. Just one right after another. Everybody that hurt me, I'm coming for you. I'm coming for you. You got to give it time. What else does bitterness need to grow? Attention. Attention. Don't you think for one single second that Absalom did not revisit this every single day. For 2 years, I can almost guarantee you, every time his head hit the pillow at night, every time he got up in the morning, every time he had some alone time, he was just replaying that over and over and over again. I'm gonna kill him. I'm going to kill him. What he did to my sister and my dad, standing back and not doing anything about it, I'm coming for him next. All bitterness needs to grow is food and forgiveness. Environment, bottle it up, keep it in, give it something to get a good culture going, give it time, and give it attention. It begins in the deep soil of pain. And then it begins to grow as we show it these things. And then I want you to see that the fruit of bitterness is poison. After it grows and it fully blossoms, it's poisonous, it's deadly, it's lethal. There is no good end to bitterness. After 2 years of holding this in and being filled with the poison of bitterness, it boils over and spreads. Whether we realize it or not, we try to satisfy our own hurt with vengeance. We try to satisfy our own hurt with vengeance. We try to avenge our hurt by hurting. I want you to get this morning. Hurt people hurt people. Hurt people hurt people. You ever cornered a hurt animal? It's dangerous. Hurt people hurt people. What does he do? First of all, he kills his brother Amnon. He kills Amnon. David said, I don't want to come to this party you've got going. Absalom says, well, at least send Amnon. You know, my favorite brother, wink, wink. So he sends him with some of his servants. Look at verse 28. Absalom told his men, wait until Amnon gets drunk. Then at my signal, kill him. Don't be afraid. I'm the one who has given this command. This is premeditated, cold-blooded murder. This is 2 years of bitterness and hatred finally spewing over. I'm going to hurt him because he hurt me. I'm going to make that joker pay for what he did to my sister and what he did to me. In verse 29, so at Absalom's signal, they murdered Amnon. Then the other sons of the king jumped on their mules and fled. How did he respond? What was the flower, the blossom of bitterness? It was, he killed Amnon first. Then he turns his sights on his daddy. David's servants and his other sons go back to Jerusalem and they say, Amnon has been killed. Absalom's done this. And David says, I don't want anything to do with him. You send word to Absalom, don't you ever come back to Jerusalem. Don't you set foot in this city again. As long as I'm alive, I don't want anything to do with you. You've ruined my life. You've killed my son, my firstborn son. I don't want anything to do with you. So time begins to grow. And Absalom knows the whole time what he's got up here. So finally he sends word to David and he says, I want to be reconciled with you, Father. After a couple of years, he says, I want to get things right with you, Dad. You know, fingers behind the back. He's got a plan. Just one right after another. So David says, you're welcome to come back to Jerusalem, but don't you come in my palace. Don't you come to my house. I don't want anything to do with you. So he moves back to Jerusalem after some more time. He sends word to David. He says, Dad, I want to reconcile with you. I'm sorry for everything I've done. You just don't understand. I was hurt. I was angry. Please welcome me back. David sends word back with Joab, his commander-in-chief of his army. Joab says, your dad don't want anything to do with you. So you just need to stay here. You just need to stay put. Well, Absalom gets mad because of his father's failure and now his father's rejection. And he burns Joab's field. Says, all right, if you won't do anything about it, I will. Absalom said to his servants, go and set fire to Joab's barley field, the field next to mine. So they set the field on fire as Absalom had commanded. You won't do what I want you to do? You're not going to feed my bitterness? I'm going to set your place on fire. Like, dude, whoa, that's a little harsh. So he goes back. David says, bring him back. Bring him to me. Absalom goes. Is reconciled with David. And look at chapter 15. The whole time he's still harboring bitterness and hatred for what his father had done. He kills Amnon, sets fire to Joab's field, and now, over 4 years, he conspires to overthrow and kill his father. Look at verse 1, chapter 15. After this, Absalom bought a chariot and horses, and he hired 50 bodyguards to run ahead of him. He got up early every morning and went out to the gate of the city. And when people brought a case to the king for judgment, Absalom would ask where in Israel they were from, and they would tell him their tribe. Then Absalom would say, you've got a really strong case here. It's too bad that the king doesn't have anyone to hear it. I wish I were the judge. Then everyone would bring their cases to me for judgment, and I would give them justice. When people tried to bow before him, Absalom wouldn't let them. Instead, he took them by the hand and kissed them. Absalom did this with everyone who came to the king for judgment, and he stole the hearts of all the people of Israel. Let me tell you something. If Absalom lived today, he would be an elected official. He's a politician. Standing outside the city gates, he's beginning his plan. 4 years, he's feeding that root of bitterness. Standing outside the gate, people would come to talk to David about issues. And that day, the king was also the judge. And he would intercept them before they could get to David, and he'd say, whoa, how are you doing? I mean, this is like small town politics right here. Where are you from? I'm from Manasseh. You know, I got a cousin that lives in Manasseh. Really? I bet we're related. Yeah, man, you look good. You lost weight. Man, he's smoozing. And then people realize he's the prince, and so they're like, well, let me pay homage and kiss you. No, let me kiss your hand. And eventually he began to win over, and he begins to say, well, you know, David is so busy, but he doesn't have anybody to hear the cases. It's almost like he doesn't care about people, so you just come to me. You just come to me. And eventually he begins to put his plan to overthrow and kill his father into action. Look at what happens. After 4 years, Absalom said to the king, David, let me go to Hebron to offer a sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill a vow that I made him. For while your servant was at Geshur in Aram, I promised to sacrifice to the Lord in Hebron, if he would bring me back to Jerusalem. Sounds like something I've heard before from some folks, right? If God will get me out of this, I'll do whatever. So he tells David, I got to go make a sacrifice to the Lord because he saved my life. All right, the king told him, go and fulfill your vow. So Absalom went to Hebron. But while he was there, he sent secret messengers to all the tribes of Israel to stir up a rebellion against the king. As soon as you hear the ram's horn, his message read, you are to say, Absalom has been crowned king in Hebron. He took 200 men from Jerusalem with him as guests, but they knew nothing of his intentions. And while Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel, one of David's counselors who lived in Gilo. Soon, many others joined Absalom, and the conspiracy gained momentum. Now he's coming after his daddy. They run David out of Jerusalem. They send an army after him, and he gathers his men, his loyal men, and they take off through the wilderness. They're running for their lives. David is being chased by his own son who's out to kill him. And an army of men. And then, to make matters worse, to prove there was a new rooster in the hen house. Remember those concubines that I told you David had? Absalom's now set up as king in Jerusalem. He's living in his daddy's palace. He has finally gotten vengeance. His dad is being chased by his army, surely to be killed in a matter of hours, if not days. And he looks to Ahithophel, his new second in command, and then verse 20 of chapter 16, he says, "What should I do?" And this is the exclamation point right here. Ahithophel told him, "Go and sleep with your father's concubines." Here's a hangnail of the Bible, okay? So this is the Bible, not Daniel. Hey, it's God's word. It's inspired. We're going to read it. "Go and sleep with your father's concubines, for he has left them here to look after the palace. Then all of Israel will know that you have insulted your father beyond hope of reconciliation, and they will throw their support to you." So they set up a tent on the palace roof where everyone could see it, and Absalom went in and had sex with his father's concubines. Guess who's in charge now? He's feeding that root of bitterness, that vengeance. Let me ask you a question this morning. How are you punishing the one that hurt you? Whoever that was, whatever that was, how are you punishing that person? Maybe you're coming out of a bad relationship, marriage. Some of you are living your whole life trying to do everything you can to get back at your ex. And what's sad is that you're bringing your kids into it, trying to pit them against that other person. How are you trying to get back? How are you trying to find revenge against your abuser? Is it cutting people off that have hurt you? Refusing to speak to them? You've been deeply hurt. How are you, like Absalom, going after that person? Vengeance is mine, saith the hurt. I'm going to make this. I'm going to rectify this. Whether you realize it or not, that's what you're doing. And just one right after another. You got a hit list. It's me against the world. I've been hurt. The fruit of bitterness is poison. It's poison. And finally, I want you to see this. If it's not uprooted, bitterness will always lead to your destruction. Bitterness will always lead to your destruction. Did you know that if you corner a rattlesnake, not that I've know by experience, but if you corner a rattlesnake and you make it mad enough, sometimes it'll bite itself. And that's what bitterness does to us. You see, let's catch up to the story. In chapter 18, Absalom and his men have chased down David and his men. And they have this great battle on the outskirts of town. And because what started over here as a great pain that turned and festered over time, this is almost 10 years have passed since that's happened. And bitterness has begun to just control David and wreck him and drive him and ruin him. And it's just one thing after another. They've hurt me, and I'm going to do everything I can to wipe them out. And now, almost 10 years later, here they are. And it's finally come to a head. David and Absalom. And in that day, 20,000 men lost their life. Because right here, he was hurt. And deep pain birthed that bitterness. And he fed it, and he watered it, and he gave it attention, and he grew it, and it spilled over. And now, 20,000 men died. You know what? You're going to take other people down with you. That bitterness will lead you to take other people down with you, and you are always the last one to go. Bitterness, if not uprooted, will always end in your destruction. Look at chapter 18, verses 9 through 18. During that battle, Absalom happened to come upon some of David's men. He tried to escape on his mule, but as he rode beneath the thick branches of a great tree, his hair got stuck in a tree. Guys, cut your hair, okay? This will happen. His mule kept going and left him dangling in the air. One of David's men saw what had happened and told Joab, "I saw Absalom dangling from a great tree." "What?" demanded Joab. "You saw him there and you didn't kill him? I would have rewarded you with 10 pieces of silver and a hero's belt." Now, prior to this, David had given a command: "If you find my son, don't kill him. I want him alive." Listen to what this man says. "I would not kill the king's son even for 1,000 pieces of silver. We all heard the king say to you and to Abishai and Ittai, 'For my sake, please spare young Absalom.' And if I had betrayed the king by killing his son, and the king would certainly find out who did it, you yourself would be the first one to abandon me. You would throw me under the bus, Joab, and you know it. If I had done this." "Enough of this nonsense," Joab said. Then he took 3 daggers and plunged them into Absalom's heart. And he dangled, still alive, in the great tree. 10 of Joab's young armor-bearers then surrounded Absalom and killed him. Then Joab blew the ram's horn, and his men returned from chasing the army of Israel. They threw Absalom's body into a deep pit in the forest and piled a great heap of stones over it. And all Israel fled to their homes. During his lifetime, it's just bitterness just ravaged this guy's life. Absalom had built a monument to himself in the king's valley, for he said, "I have no son to carry my name." Still bitter to the end. He named the monument after himself, and it is known as Absalom's monument to this day. Absalom was a very bitter man with a very bitter life that ended in a very bitter way. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the church at Ephesus, said this to the church. And he says this to you. He says this to me. Get rid of all bitterness. It's poisonous. All rage, anger, harsh words, slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. Instead, be kind to each other. Tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God, through Christ, forgave you. Some of you are being eaten alive with the poisonous root of bitterness. Someone's hurt you, done something to you. Something's happened to you. And you know what? We try everything to get rid of that in our lives. We try everything to... Have you ever tried to get rid of a weed? You can chop it down, it's going to grow back. We try therapy. We try going to church. We try reading books. Like sometimes we even try listening to Christian radio. We try talking to other people. We try getting counsel. Let me tell you something. You can fake it. You can try to forget it. That happened to me, so I'm just going to put it on the back burner and hope it goes away. You can fake it. You can forget it. Or try to forget it. But the only way you will ever uproot bitterness in your life is if you forgive. There's no other way around it, folks. The Bible doesn't give you any other option. Well, you don't know what they did to me. I don't. And I don't know that hurt, and I don't know that pain. I just know that the Bible says forgiveness is the only way to freedom from that poisonous root of bitterness. Forgiveness, coming to that place where you say, through the power of Christ, I'm going to forgive. And I don't know how that looks, but God, I just pray that you would help me. There's no other way. You can try to hack down that root, but unless you pull it up by the root, the only way to do that is forgiveness. The bitter root will poison you for the rest of your life. In Exodus chapter 15, Moses was leading the people of Israel through the wilderness. It says Moses led the people of Israel away from the Red Sea, and they moved out into the desert of Shur. And they traveled in this desert for 3 days without finding any water. When they came to the oasis of Marah, the water was too bitter to drink. was making the people sick. People were on the verge of death. They were so thirsty, they were so parched, but the water was bitter. So they called the place Marah, which means bitter. And watch what happens. The people complained and they turned against Moses. And they said, what are we going to drink? So Moses cried out to the Lord for help, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. Now, if you want to dig into the real meaning of that in the Hebrew, it's literally a tree. A tree. Not just a piece of, not a plank of wood that was just laying there. It was a literal tree. So Moses threw it into the water. And this made the water good to drink. So this is not some isolated, random event that happens in the Old Testament that we look at and then we go, man, that was a really cool trick Moses did. What is the Bible all about? It's about Jesus. The whole Old Testament is moving its way towards the cross. Several thousand years after this event, right here, there was another tree. A tree on which the Son of God hanged and died. To take the bitter poison of sin on himself. So that sinners could come and leave cleansed. The tree takes bitterness and turns it into life-giving water. Several of you, I'd say many or most of you are saved this morning. First group of people in this room, I want to address you. If you're not saved, if you've never given your life to Jesus, I want to invite you to come to that tree where the blood of Jesus flows for you and for me to give us cleansing from our sin. That's the greatest decision you'll ever make in your life. But the second group of people in here are believers. If you're a Christian and you are holding on to that bitterness and it is influencing and directing every decision you've made and it is just controlling and ruining your life, come to the tree and be healed. Come to the tree broken and bent and then leave on the other side of that tree in the resurrecting life of Jesus. So this morning, I've been praying for you all week because I know there's somebody in here that's dealing with this. I want you to come this morning and give it over to the Lord and be healed, be cleansed, and just let go and ask Him to heal you and turn that bitterness into life-giving water in your life.